Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. In the heart of 19th century Paris, a mysterious artist named Etienne Marceau had gained notoriety not only for his extraordinary talent, but for the whispers that surrounded his work. People spoke of paintings that seemed too alive, portraits with eyes that followed you, and scenes so vivid they felt as though they would leap from the canvas. One evening, a wealthy but vain young nobleman named Julien Duval visited Etienne's studio. Julien was known for his striking beauty and endless pursuit of pleasure. But he feared one thing above all, the inevitable march of time and the decay it brought. "I want you to paint my portrait," Julien said, his voice tinged with desperation. "A masterpiece that will preserve me as I am now, forever young." Etienne, with his piercing eyes and an almost otherworldly demeanor, considered Julien's request. "Such a painting comes at a cost," the artist warned. "Are you willing to pay it?" Julien, blinded by his vanity, waved away the warning. "Name your price." Etienne smiled faintly and gestured for Julien to sit. As he began to paint, the atmosphere in the studio grew heavy, as if the very air was being infused into the canvas. Julien felt a strange sensation, a pull deep within him, but he dismissed it as the excitement of his impending immortality. When the portrait was finished, Julien was stunned. The painting captured him perfectly. Every line of his face, every glimmer in his eyes. It was as though he were staring into a mirror. But Etienne's final words lingered in the air. "Beware of the bond between you and the painting. It holds more than your image." At first, Julien thought nothing of the artist's cryptic warning. He hung the portrait in his grand estate, admiring it daily. But as the years passed, Julien noticed something strange. He didn't age. His skin remained smooth, his hair as dark as the day he sat for the painting. He reveled in his agelessness, indulging in every vice imaginable: wine, women, gambling, without the fear of time catching up to him. He became the envy of his peers and the obsession of many. But the portrait was changing. At first, Julien noticed only subtle differences: a shadow beneath the eyes, a faint line at the corner of the mouth. But as decades passed, the transformation became grotesque. The figure in the painting grew older and older, its beauty decaying into a horrific visage. The eyes, once vibrant, became sunken and bloodshot. The skin sagged, wrinkled, and discolored. One evening, overcome by curiosity and dread, Julien examined the painting closely. As he stared into its ghastly eyes, he realized the truth. The painting bore the weight of his years. Every sin, every indulgence, every moment of cruelty was etched into its surface. Julien's agelessness became a curse. While his appearance remained untouched, he began to feel the weight of the years in his soul. Memories of the lives he had ruined, the hearts he had broken, and the countless acts of selfishness haunted him. The portrait became unbearable to look at. Julien hid it in the attic, locking the door and swearing never to see it again. But no matter how far he tried to distance himself, he could feel its presence, watching, judging. His behavior grew erratic. He avoided mirrors, fearing the reflection might reveal his true self. He distanced himself from friends and family, terrified they would uncover his secret. Despite his isolation, whispers of his eternal youth spread. Rumors turned to legends, and Julien became a figure of both awe and suspicion. Years turned into centuries. Julien's estate fell into disrepair, its once grand halls now cloaked in dust and cobwebs. He wandered the empty rooms, a shadow of his former self. Though his body remained untouched by time, his mind began to fray. The painting called to him in his dreams, its grotesque figure mocking him. "Look at me," it would whisper. See what you've become. One stormy night, unable to bear the torment any longer, Julian climbed to the attic. The door, untouched for decades, creaked open. There it was, the portrait, more horrifying than he remembered. The figure in the painting was barely human now, its face twisted into a mask of agony and malice. "Why?" Julian screamed. "Why do you torment me?" The room seemed to respond, the shadows twisting and the air growing colder. "Because you chose this," a voice whispered, low and menacing. "You wanted eternal youth, but you never asked what it would cost." Julian, consumed by rage and despair, grabbed a knife. "If I destroy you," he said, "I'll be free." He plunged the blade into the canvas. The room erupted in a blinding light, and a scream echoed through the estate, a sound that was both his and not his. As the painting tore, Julian felt an unbearable pain coursing through his body. He stumbled backward, his reflection catching in a dusty mirror. For the first time in centuries, he saw his true self. His face was gaunt, his hair white and brittle, his skin mottled and decayed. He aged decades in seconds, his body finally succumbing to the years it had avoided. The portrait, now a tattered ruin, no longer bore his likeness. It was empty, a blank canvas. The estate was abandoned for years until it was purchased by a young couple eager to restore its former glory. While cleaning the attic, they discovered the torn remains of the portrait. "It's beautiful, even like this," the woman said, running her fingers over the edges. The man laughed. "It's just an old painting. Let's hang it in the gallery downstairs." That night, as the couple slept, the canvas began to shift. Slowly, a new image emerged. A perfect likeness of the man, his youthful face smiling back from the painting. And so, the cycle began again. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Eleanor stumbled upon the bookshop. Tucked away in a forgotten alley, the shop had no name, only a faded sign above the door that read, "Rare and Antique Books." Eleanor, a devoted bibliophile, was drawn to it immediately. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered, and a faint, musty scent greeted her. Leather bindings, old paper, and time. The shop was cramped and dimly lit, the shelves towering high and packed with books that looked centuries old. Behind the counter sat an elderly man with piercing eyes and a knowing smile. "Looking for something special?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated. "Just browsing," she replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she wandered, her fingers trailed over the spines of countless volumes until she reached a small table at the back. On it lay a single book, its cover plain and unmarked. Something about it caught her attention. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it in her hands. "That one's unique," the shopkeeper said, suddenly standing behind her. "What's it about?" Eleanor asked, turning the book over. "It doesn't tell a story," he replied cryptically. "It shows you yours." Intrigued, Eleanor decided to buy it. As she left the shop, the man's parting words echoed in her mind. "Be careful what you think while you read." That evening, Eleanor settled into her favorite armchair by the window. The book's pages were blank, but she couldn't resist opening it. As soon as she did, words began to appear, scrawling across the page as though an invisible hand were writing them. Eleanor sat in her armchair, the book heavy in her lap. She couldn't help but feel a strange excitement, though a flicker of unease stirred in her chest. Her breath hitched. The words described exactly what she was doing, what she was feeling. She turned the page and the writing continued. She wondered if the book could truly read her thoughts. The idea was thrilling and terrifying all at once. Eleanor snapped the book shut, her heart racing. "It's just a trick," she muttered to herself. But curiosity gnawed at her. The next day, she opened the book again. This time, she decided to test it. She thought about her childhood, the games she played with her brother in their backyard. The book responded immediately. Memories of a sunny yard filled Eleanor's mind. her brother's laughter, the scent of freshly cut grass. Eleanor's fascination grew. The book wasn't just recording her thoughts, it was pulling them from the deepest recesses of her mind. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor couldn't stay away from the book. It became a ritual. Every evening she would sit with it, watching as it laid her thoughts bare. But the more she used it, the more intrusive the book became. One night, as she flipped the pages, the book began to write on its own. Eleanor had been avoiding the truth, but the book knew. It remembered what she tried to forget. "What truth?" she whispered, her hands trembling. The next page revealed a memory she had long buried, the night of the car accident. She was 18, driving home from a party. It had been raining, and she'd had too much to drink. She lost control, veering into a tree. She survived, but the passenger, her best friend, Claire, did not. Eleanor slammed the book shut, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't told anyone the full story, and yet the book knew. Despite her fear, Eleanor couldn't resist the book's pull. Each night, it delved deeper into her mind, uncovering secrets and memories she didn't even know she had. It began to show her thoughts she didn't want to acknowledge: envy toward her colleagues, resentment toward her family, and guilt over her failures. Worse still, the book started predicting her actions. It would describe events moments before they happened. Eleanor reached for the cup of tea, her hand trembling slightly. She froze, staring at the words. Then, as if compelled, she picked up her tea. The book's accuracy terrified her. Over time, the book's influence grew. It no longer waited for Eleanor to read it. Words would appear whenever she was nearby, as if it were writing her life in real time. One day she opened it to find Eleanor would not go to work today. Instead, she would visit the bridge. Confused, she glanced at her watch. She was already late for work, but the idea of the bridge, a place she hadn't visited in years, filled her mind. Before she knew it, she was driving there. As she stood on the bridge, staring into the rushing water below, the book's words echoed in her mind. She felt the urge to jump, to let the water wash everything away. She screamed and threw the book into the river, watching as it disappeared beneath the surface. For a moment she felt relief. Eleanor tried to move on. Weeks passed, and she began to feel normal again. But one night, she heard a thud at her front door. When she opened it, the book was lying on her doorstep, dry and pristine. "No," she whispered, backing away. The book opened on its own, pages flipping wildly until they stopped. Words began to appear. "You cannot escape me. I know your every thought, your every fear. We are bound together now." Eleanor tried to destroy it, burning it, tearing it apart, but it always returned, unscathed. She became a prisoner in her own home, unable to think or act without fearing the book's judgment. Desperate for answers, Eleanor returned to the bookshop, but it was gone. In its place was an empty lot. She asked around, but no one remembered the shop or the old man who ran it. Alone and hopeless, she opened the book one final time. Eleanor would never be free of the book, but there was one way to end its power. It didn't need to say more. She understood. That night, Eleanor's neighbors heard a crash. When they entered her house, they found her lifeless body next to the book, which had finally fallen silent. The book disappeared again, only to reappear in another dusty corner of a forgotten shop waiting for its next reader. The village of Ashford was a quiet, idyllic place nestled at the foot of rolling hills. But its serene appearance hid a chilling secret: the legend of the weeping spirit. The story was told in hushed tones, especially to children who dared to lie. According to lore, the ghost of a woman roamed the village, her sorrow eternal. It was said that every time someone told a lie, her mournful wails would fill the air, and tears of anguish would stream down her translucent face. Some claimed to have seen her, standing at the edge of the forest or appearing in a mirror's reflection. Her presence was always the same, eyes swollen with sorrow, her body racked with sobs. Her cries were a warning, a reminder of the cost of deceit. But who was this spirit, and why was she bound to lies? Years ago, long before the legend was whispered, there lived a woman named Eleanor Hart. She was the daughter of a humble farmer and was known throughout the village for her beauty and kindness. Eleanor had a peculiar talent. She could always tell when someone was lying. Her gift was both a blessing and a curse. Some admired her honesty and sharp intuition, but others resented her for exposing their falsehoods. Despite this, Eleanor remained steadfast in her values, believing that truth was the foundation of trust and community. Eleanor fell in love with a man named Thomas Reed, a charming merchant who traveled often. Thomas promised her the world, adventures beyond the village, a grand home, and a life filled with love. Blinded by her affection, Eleanor believed him. But Thomas was not the man he claimed to be. Beneath his charming facade was a web of lies. He was already married to a woman in another town and used his travels to weave his deceptions. One fateful evening, Eleanor overheard a conversation between Thomas and another villager. His words confirmed her worst fears. Every promise he had made was a lie. Devastated, she confronted him. "I loved you, Thomas," she cried. "How could you betray me?" Thomas, unrepentant, dismissed her as foolish. "Everyone lies, Eleanor. It's the way of the world. You should know that by now." Heartbroken and humiliated, Eleanor fled into the forest, where she was later found dead at the edge of the river. Some said she drowned herself in despair. Others whispered that her broken heart simply stopped beating. After Eleanor's death, strange occurrences began in the village. People would hear soft sobbing, even when no one was around. Mirrors fogged as if someone were crying nearby. Worst of all, villagers who lied found themselves haunted by the sound of Eleanor's wails, growing louder with every untruth they spoke. Over time, the villagers came to believe that Eleanor's spirit had returned, bound to their lies. Her grief became their burden, a punishment for their dishonesty. Generations later, the legend of the weeping spirit was still alive. Parents warned their children, "Don't lie or Eleanor will find you." Though most dismissed the story as a ghost tale, there were those who knew better. Claire Bennett, a journalist visiting Ashford, was one such skeptic. She was writing an article about local legends and found the story of the weeping spirit intriguing. "It's just a morality tale," Claire said to her guide, an elderly man named Mr. Carter. "A way to keep people honest." Mr. Carter shook his head gravely. "You might think that, Miss Bennett, but those who have heard her cries know better." Curious, Claire decided to investigate further. One evening, as Claire walked through the village, she noticed how quiet it was. No children played in the streets, and doors were locked tight. She made her way to the forest, where Eleanor was said to appear. As she set up her camera, a cold breeze swept through the trees, and the air grew heavy. Suddenly, a faint sobbing sound reached her ears. "Hello," Claire called out, her voice trembling slightly. The sobbing grew louder. Turning around, she saw a figure emerging from the shadows, a woman with pale, translucent skin and tear-streaked cheeks. "Eleanor?" Claire whispered. The ghost nodded, her sorrowful eyes locking onto Claire's. "Why are you here?" Claire asked. Eleanor's voice was soft, like the rustling of leaves. "Because you lie." Claire's stomach dropped. "I don't lie," she insisted. Eleanor's sobs intensified, her body trembling. The sound was unbearable, a symphony of anguish that seemed to pierce Claire's soul. She stumbled backward, realizing that Eleanor's presence forced her to confront the truth she had avoided. The ghost followed Claire relentlessly, her cries haunting every moment. At first, Claire tried to rationalize it. "It's stress," she told herself. "I'm imagining things." But Eleanor's presence was undeniable. One night, unable to bear the wailing any longer, Claire screamed, "What do you want from me?" Eleanor's voice was barely audible over her sobs. The truth. Claire's lies unraveled in her mind. The fabricated stories she had written to further her career. The promises she had broken to loved ones. The truths she had buried deep. Tears streamed down Claire's face as she confessed them all, her voice raw with emotion. When she finished, Eleanor's crying subsided, replaced by a heavy silence. The ghost gazed at her with something akin to relief before disappearing into the night. After that night, Claire left Ashford, but she couldn't forget what had happened. She wrote about Eleanor's story, urging people to embrace honesty and face their truths. Back in Ashford, Eleanor's presence remained. The villagers still heard her cries whenever a lie was told, a haunting reminder of the power of truth. And so, the legend of the weeping spirit lived on, teaching generations that while lies may be easy, they come at a cost, one that even death cannot erase. Nestled deep in the mountains of the northern wilderness, the village of Frosthaven was a place where life moved slowly. Winters were long and harsh, but the villagers had adapted over generations. They had sturdy homes, ample wood for their hearths, and a deep respect for the unforgiving weather. Above the village loomed Mount Hollow, a peak shrouded in mystery. Few dared to climb it, not only because of the treacherous paths, but because of the chilling legend tied to it. The story was an old one, passed down in whispers. If the winds of Mount Hollow cry too loudly, and the first snowflake falls from a silent sky, a storm will begin. And once it begins, it will never end. Most dismiss the tale as superstition, but the elders of Frosthaven always warned, the mountain doesn't forget, it doesn't forgive. It was late November when the first signs of the storm appeared. The day had been unusually warm, with a strange stillness in the air. No birds sang, and even the rivers seemed to flow more quietly. The villagers, accustomed to nature's mood swings, thought little of it. But as the sun set, the winds began to howl. Not the usual whistle of a winter breeze, but a deep, mournful cry that seemed to echo from the mountain itself. At precisely midnight, the first snowflake fell. It drifted down lazily, landing on the town square's cobblestone fountain. Moments later, snow began to fall heavily, blanketing the village in an eerie silence. At first, the villagers welcomed the snowfall. It was nothing unusual for Frosthaven, where winter storms could last for days. Families gathered by their fires, sharing stories and hot meals. But the storm didn't end. By the third day, the snow was waist deep. By the fifth, it reached the roofs of smaller homes. The winds howled incessantly, and the air grew colder by the hour. The villagers worked tirelessly to clear paths and keep their homes warm, but there was no reprieve. Supplies began to dwindle, and fear settled in. "It's the mountain," whispered Greta, the oldest villager. "We've angered it." According to Greta, the legend of the eternal snowstorm dated back to a time when the village was new. A group of travelers had sought shelter on Mount Hollow during a fierce blizzard. They were desperate, cold, and starving. But instead of respecting the mountain's resources, they hunted its sacred animals and destroyed its ancient trees for firewood. When the storm passed, they returned to the village, boasting of their survival. But the mountain was angry. That winter, a storm descended upon the village and did not relent until every traveler was claimed by its wrath. Since then, Greta said, the mountain watches. If its peace is disturbed, the snow will come, and it will never stop. By the 10th day of the storm, Frosthaven was unrecognizable. The snow buried the village under layers of ice, and even the tallest buildings were hidden beneath the drifts. The villagers were running out of food, and their fires struggled to stay lit against the biting cold. The winds carried strange whispers, voices that seemed to call from the depths of the snow. Some claimed to see figures in the storm, shadowy shapes moving through the blizzard. "We need to appease the mountain," Greta insisted. "Offer it something valuable, something sacred." But what could they offer? A group of villagers decided to climb Mount Hollow, hoping to find a way to stop the storm. Among them were Eric, a young hunter, his sister Lila, known for her courage, and Father Donovan, the village priest. The journey was treacherous. The storm's fury intensified as they ascended, and the snow felt alive, pulling at their boots and blinding their eyes. Halfway up the mountain, they found an ancient altar buried beneath the snow. Carved into the stone were symbols no one recognized, but they emanated an undeniable sense of power. Father Donovan prayed while Eric and Lila placed what little they had onto the altar: a piece of bread, a silver pendant, and a small vial of oil. But nothing happened. "It's not enough," Lila whispered. "The mountain wants more." The whispers grew louder, and the wind seemed to push them toward the altar. Desperation took hold. Eric, realizing the truth, stepped forward. "It wants us," he said. Before anyone could stop him, Eric placed his hands on the altar. The wind roared, and in an instant, he vanished, consumed by the storm. When Lila and Father Donovan returned to the village, the storm began to subside. The villagers emerged from their homes, relieved to see the sky clearing. But their relief was short-lived. Eric was gone, and Lila knew the truth. The mountain had taken him as payment. Though the storm ended, the villagers never forgot the horror of those endless days. A memorial was built at the base of Mount Hollow, warning future generations to respect the mountain and its power. To this day, the people of Frosthaven listen closely to the winds. If they cry too loudly and the first snowflake falls from a silent sky, they know the storm will come again. And this time, it might never end. On the outskirts of the quiet town of Black Hollow lay an ancient forest known as the Whispering Woods. Dense with towering oaks and thick underbrush, it was both a place of beauty and unease. Generations of locals had grown up hearing stories about a mysterious path within the woods. Known as the Lost Trail, it was said to appear only to wanderers who strayed too far from the beaten track. Legends claim that anyone who walked the Lost Trail never returned, disappearing without a trace. Some said it led to another world, a dimension far removed from the one they knew. Others whispered that the path was alive, a malevolent force luring the curious to their doom. But stories are just stories until they're not. It began one crisp autumn morning when 16-year-old Clara Hastings vanished. Clara was known for her adventurous spirit, often exploring the woods despite the warnings. That morning, she had told her parents she was going for a short walk. When she didn't return by nightfall, the town organized a search party. Dozens of volunteers combed the woods, calling Clara's name, but found no trace of her. The search continued for days, yet it was as if she had simply ceased to exist. Among the searchers was Clara's older brother, Samuel. Driven by guilt and grief, he refused to give up. He spent hours wandering the woods, hoping for any sign of his sister. Then on the 7th day, he found something. A narrow, overgrown trail that wasn't there before. The trail seemed to shimmer in the dim light filtering through the trees, almost as if it were alive. Samuel felt a strange pull toward it, an unexplainable urge to follow where it led. He hesitated, remembering the old tales about the lost trail. But the thought of Clara, lost and alone, overpowered his fear. Ignoring the voice in his head screaming for him to turn back, he stepped onto the path. At first, the trail seemed unremarkable, winding through the forest like any other. But as Samuel walked, he began to notice subtle changes. The trees grew taller and darker, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sunlight. The air grew heavy, filled with an unnatural silence. Then came the whispers. Faint and indistinct at first, they grew louder with each step. Samuel couldn't make out the words, but the voices seemed to be calling his name. Shadows moved in the periphery of his vision, though when he turned to look, there was nothing there. The path itself changed, the dirt underfoot becoming smoother and darker, almost like polished stone. Strange, glowing plants lined the edges, casting an eerie blue light. Samuel realized he was no longer in the Whispering Woods, or anywhere on Earth. As Samuel continued, the whispers coalesced into something more tangible. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, faint, translucent beings that seemed to float rather than walk. Their faces were indistinct, their forms shifting like smoke. One of them approached him, its voice echoing in his mind rather than his ears. "Why have you come?" it asked. "I'm looking for my sister," Samuel replied, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head as if pondering his words. "The one who strayed? She is here, but the path does not give without taking." "What does that mean?" Samuel demanded, but the figure faded before he could get an answer. Samuel pressed on, the path growing stranger with every step. He passed through landscapes that defied logic, a forest where the trees bled sap as red as blood, a meadow filled with flowers that sang mournful songs, a river that flowed upward into the sky. Finally, he came to a clearing where the path ended abruptly. In the center stood Clara, her back turned to him. Relief flooded Samuel as he called her name and ran to her. But when she turned to face him, he froze. Clara's eyes were wide and unblinking, her expression blank. "You shouldn't have come," she said in a monotone voice. "I came to bring you home," Samuel insisted. "You can't," she replied. "The path has claimed me, and now it will claim you." Before Samuel could respond, the ground beneath him began to shift. The clearing darkened as a massive figure emerged from the shadows. It was neither human nor animal, but a grotesque amalgamation of both. Its body was composed of twisting vines and bones, and its hollow eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. "I am the keeper of the path," the creature intoned, its voice reverberating through the clearing. "Those who walk my trail belong to me." Samuel stood his ground. "I won't leave without her." The keeper chuckled, a sound like rustling leaves in cracking wood. "Then you will both remain? The path does not release its wanderers. You have chosen to walk it, and now you are bound to it." Desperation gave Samuel strength. He grabbed Clara's hand and tried to run, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The whispers grew deafening, and the shadows closed in, reaching out with claw-like tendrils. Just as Samuel thought they were doomed, he remembered the stories Greta used to tell. The path, she had said, fed on fear and despair. It thrived on submission. Summoning every ounce of courage, Samuel stopped running. "You can't have us," he shouted into the void. "We don't belong to you." The shadows recoiled, and the whispers fell silent. The keeper appeared once more, its hollow eyes narrowing. "Bold words," it said, "but boldness has a cost." The keeper extended a clawed hand. "One of you may leave," it said. "The other must stay. Choose." Samuel didn't hesitate. "Take me. Let her go." Clara's expression shifted, her eyes filling with tears. "No, Sam, I won't let you." But the keeper raised its hand, silencing her. "So be it," it said. Samuel woke up at the edge of the whispering woods alone. The villagers found him hours later, disoriented and rambling about the lost trail. Clara was never seen again. Samuel spent the rest of his life searching for a way back, but the lost trail never appeared to him again. The forest remained silent, its secrets buried within its twisted depths, and the path waited, patient and eternal, for its next wanderer. On the edge of a desolate countryside, far from bustling towns and busy roads, stood a sprawling, decrepit mansion known as Hollow Oaks. Its windows were cracked, its paint chipped, and its towers tilted slightly as if bowing to time. No one had lived there for decades, but everyone in the nearby village knew its legend, the voice that echoed through its empty rooms. It wasn't just any voice. It spoke to those who dared to enter, calling them by name, whispering secrets no one else could know, and leading them deeper into the mansion's labyrinthine halls. Those who went in never stayed long. Some fled, driven mad by the unrelenting whispers. Others left with stories of the voice following them home. haunting them until their dying breath. For years, Hollow Oaks remained untouched, shrouded in its eerie reputation. But as the years passed, curiosity grew. One chilly November afternoon, three university students, Mara, Ethan, and Sophia, arrived in the village. The trio had heard rumors about Hollow Oaks and decided to investigate it for their paranormal research project. They were skeptical of ghost stories, believing there was always a rational explanation behind so-called hauntings. The villagers tried to warn them. An elderly man, leaning heavily on his cane, approached them as they gathered their gear. "Don't go," he croaked. "That place doesn't let you leave the same." "We'll be fine," Mara assured him with a smile, though her voice wavered slightly. Ethan, the most pragmatic of the group, dismissed the warning entirely. "It's just old house creaks and echoes. Nothing we haven't seen before." With that, they set off for the mansion. Hollow Oaks loomed larger than they had expected, its dark silhouette cutting against the gray sky. As they pushed open the heavy front doors, a gust of stale air greeted them, carrying with it the faintest sound of movement. The grand foyer was vast, with a sweeping staircase covered in tattered carpet and walls adorned with peeling wallpaper. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like curtains. Yet there was a strange quality to the silence, a heaviness, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Mara switched on her recorder. "Hollow Oaks, November 12th, she began, her voice echoing faintly. The echo didn't fade. Instead, it repeated her words, softly, almost mockingly. "Hollow Oaks, November 12th. They froze, exchanging uneasy glances. "Just an acoustics thing," Ethan said, though he looked less certain. As they moved deeper into the mansion, the voice grew bolder. It no longer mimicked their words, but spoke independently. "Why are you here?" it whispered, the sound slithering through the air like smoke. Sophia, clutching her flashlight tightly, turned sharply. "Did you hear that?" Mara nodded, her recorder still running. "Who are you?" she called out. The voice responded almost immediately. "Who are you?" It echoed, this time with a mocking tone. Ethan frowned, holding up his EMF detector. The needle flickered erratically, though there were no apparent sources of interference. "It's just residual energy," he muttered, trying to convince himself as much as the others. But the voice wasn't residual. It was intelligent, and it was watching them. The voice began to address them by name. Mara, brave but foolish. Ethan, skeptic but scared. Sophia, hiding the truth. They froze, their breaths shallow. "How does it know our names?" Sophia whispered. "It's guessing," Ethan said, though his voice betrayed him. The voice chuckled, a hollow, unsettling sound. "Do you think I'm guessing?" it asked. "I see you. I know you. I know why you've come." The whispers grew louder, overlapping, surrounding them like an unseen crowd. They spoke of memories, things none of them had shared aloud. Mara's fear of disappointing her parents, Ethan's guilt over a childhood betrayal, Sophia's shame over a love she had kept secret. "Stop it!" Sophia shouted, her voice cracking. But the voice didn't stop. It fed on their fear, growing stronger with every step they took. The group decided to leave, but the mansion seemed to conspire against them. Doors that had been open slammed shut. Hallways twisted, leading them in circles. The staircase back to the foyer crumbled as they approached it. The voice followed them, now deeper and more commanding. "You cannot leave," it said. "You are part of this house now." They stumbled into a vast ballroom, its once grand chandelier hanging precariously. The voice boomed, filling the space. "Do you know what happened here?" Before they could answer, the room changed. The dust and decay vanished, replaced by opulence and warmth. The ballroom filled with ghostly figures dressed in elegant attire. They danced and laughed, their joy palpable until it wasn't. Suddenly the music stopped. The figures froze, their faces contorting in terror. One by one, they began to scream. their bodies collapsing into lifeless heaps. The students watched, horrified, as the scene repeated itself like a macabre loop. Mara's recorder crackled, the voice returning. "This house consumes all who enter," it said. "Once it was alive with music and laughter, but greed and betrayal poisoned it. Blood was spilled, and the house remembered. It keeps us here, keeps me here." "Who are you?" Mara demanded, tears streaming down her face. "I am what's left," the voice replied. "The echoes of the living, bound to these walls. And now you are too." Desperate, the trio decided to fight back. Ethan smashed through a boarded-up window, and Sophia threw a heavy candelabra at the ballroom door. But no matter what they tried, the house resisted. Mara, in a moment of clarity, addressed the voice. "What do you want from us?" The voice hesitated, then whispered, "Freedom." Understanding dawned. The house wasn't holding the voice captive. It was the other way around. The voice was the house, a sentient being feeding on fear and despair. Mara made a choice. She picked up her recorder and said, "You don't have to do this. Let us go, and we'll tell your story. We'll remember you." The house shuddered, the walls groaning as if in pain. For a moment, the voice fell silent. Then with a final whisper, "Go!" The front doors burst open. The students fled, never looking back. When they returned to the village, they found the elderly man waiting. He simply nodded as if he had known they would survive. But the experience left its mark. Mara couldn't sleep without hearing whispers. Ethan destroyed all their equipment, vowing never to investigate the paranormal again. Sophia refused to speak of what they had seen, and Hollow Oaks remained, waiting patiently for the next visitors to step inside. For the voice still echoed through its empty rooms, growing louder with each passing day. At the heart of an old fog-draped town stood a library unlike any other. The sign above its towering oak doors read, "Morrigan's Archive." It was an imposing structure, built of dark stone with Gothic spires that clawed at the sky. It seemed to absorb the light, casting shadows even on the brightest days. Elena, a young woman with a lifelong passion for books, arrived at the library one overcast morning. She had recently been hired as the new caretaker after the previous librarian mysteriously vanished. Eager to escape her small apartment and the monotony of her quiet life, she saw this as the perfect opportunity to immerse herself in the world of stories. She was greeted by a key delivered in an unmarked envelope and a single note that read, Elena laughed nervously, chalking it up to the eccentricities of her new employers. She loved the idea of working in such an old, atmospheric place. The peculiar warning only added to its charm, or so she thought. The library was vast. Its interior seemed much larger than its exterior, with endless rows of bookshelves that stretched far beyond what Elena had anticipated. The air smelled of aged paper and ink, and a faint, inexplicable hum filled the silence. The first few days were uneventful. Elena organized books, cleaned the dust off tables, and admired the intricate carvings on the shelves. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she heard it, a faint whisper, like someone reading aloud in a hushed tone. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty halls. No one answered, but the whispering continued, growing slightly louder. She followed the sound, weaving through the labyrinth of shelves, until she came to an isolated section at the very back of the library. The whispering stopped. Elena frowned, scanning the titles on the shelves. They were old, some with faded gold lettering, others with spines so worn the titles were illegible. One book stood out, a thick, leather-bound tome with no title at all. When she touched it, the whispering resumed, louder now, more insistent. She opened the book. The pages were blank, except for one line that appeared as she stared. Elena's breath hitched. She slammed the book shut and stepped back, her heart racing. She laughed nervously, convincing herself she must be tired, that it was some sort of optical illusion. But when she turned to leave, she heard it again, whispering, not from one book, but from dozens. The next day, Elena tried to put the incident out of her mind. But as night fell, the whispering returned. This time it was impossible to ignore. The books seemed to hum with energy, their spines vibrating slightly as she walked past. Unable to resist her curiosity, she plucked a random book from the shelf. As she opened it, words appeared on the blank pages, forming a story in real time. The voice of an elderly man filled the air, narrating the tale of his life, his childhood, his heartbreak, his mistakes. Elena could feel his emotions, his sorrow, his joy, his regret, as though they were her own. When the story ended, the book fell silent. Fascinated, she picked up another. This time it was a young girl's voice, recounting a tragic love story. The voice quivered with emotion, and Elena felt tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. Each book told a story, not written by an author, but lived by someone who once existed. The library wasn't just a repository of books, it was a collection of lives. Elena became obsessed. Every night she ventured deeper into the library, listening to the voices of the books. She learned of wars and revolutions, forbidden romances, and unsolved mysteries. Some stories were inspiring, others heartbreaking, and a few were so horrifying she had to stop reading. But the more she read, the more she noticed something strange. The books began to mention her. "Elena will understand," one book said. "She's different," whispered another. At first she thought it was a coincidence, but the more she read, the clearer it became. The books were aware of her presence. One night, as she read a particularly chilling story about a man who vanished without a trace, the voice in the book paused. "You shouldn't be here after dark," it said. Elena froze. "Why not?" she whispered aloud. The book didn't answer. Instead, the whispering around her grew louder, more frantic. She slammed the book shut and ran for the exit, the voices echoing behind her. Elena decided to research the library's history. She discovered that it had been built centuries ago by a mysterious scholar named Adric Morgan. According to legend, Morgan had been obsessed with preserving knowledge. Not just written knowledge, but the essence of people's lives. Some said he had made a pact with an otherworldly entity, binding the souls of the dead to the library's books. Others believed the library itself was alive, feeding on the memories and emotions of those who entered. The previous librarians had all disappeared, leaving no trace. Determined to uncover the truth, Elena returned to the library one last time. She went straight to the back section where she had first heard the whispers. The leather-bound book was waiting for her. This time, when she opened it, the pages filled with a new story, her own. It recounted her arrival at the library, her curiosity, and her growing obsession. It even described the very moment she was experiencing, standing in the dim light, reading the book. The final line made her blood run cold. The lights flickered. The whispering turned into a deafening roar. Books flew off the shelves, their pages fluttering like wings. Elena tried to run, but the library wouldn't let her. The walls seemed to close in, the shelves twisting and reshaping themselves into an impenetrable maze. As the chaos consumed her, she heard the voice of the leather-bound book one last time. Months later, the villagers noticed that the library had reopened. A young man drawn by rumors of the strange archive had taken the position of caretaker. He received the same key, the same note, but unlike Elena, he didn't heed the warning. And deep within Morgan's archive, a new book appeared on the shelves, a leather-bound tome with no title. Inside, the story of a woman named Elena waited to be read.